She was my teacher, brilliant, untouchable, and years ahead of me. But the day she asked me to stay after class, something in her eyes said this lesson wouldn't be about books. The last bell of the day had already rung, but the classroom lingered in that strange kind of silence only late afternoons can hold, the kind that feels like the world is pausing, just for a breath. Golden light poured through the tall windows, stretching soft shadows across the rows of empty desks. The faint scent of chalk and old paper lingered in the air, mixed with a trace of her perfume, subtle, elegant, something I couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore either. I was halfway out the door when I heard her voice. "Stay after class for a moment," she said, calm, almost casual. But something about the way her words rested between us made me stop. It wasn't a command, it felt more like an invitation. Turning back, I saw her sitting behind her desk, a few papers spread in front of her. The sleeves of her blouse were slightly rolled, her hair loosely pinned as if she had been too focused to notice a strand slipping free near her cheek. She looked up at me with a glance that lingered just a heartbeat longer than necessary. I stepped closer, my bag still slung over my shoulder. "Is something wrong with my assignment?" I asked, though her expression didn't hold any trace of frustration. She shook her head slightly, a faint smile touching her lips. "Not wrong. I just wanted to talk about how you approached it. There's something in the way you think. It's different." The room felt heavier now, not uncomfortable, just charged, as if the air itself had thickened. I set my bag down on the nearest desk, the scrape of the strap loud in the quiet. She picked up a piece of chalk absent-mindedly, turning it between her fingers as she spoke. Her hand reached toward the board, but paused halfway, her fingers resting on the wooden ledge. My own hand, steadying a notebook on the desk, was only inches away. For a brief, fleeting second, the space between our hands felt like the thinnest of walls, almost nothing at all. I found myself noticing details I hadn't before, the soft curve of her handwriting on the papers, the faint tiredness in her eyes that didn't take away from their brightness, the way her voice dropped slightly when she was thinking. "Your perspective, it's refreshing," she continued, her eyes flicking up to meet mine. "Most people just write what they think I want to hear. You didn't." A faint hum of the ceiling fan filled the silence that followed. The golden light outside was shifting now, dipping lower, painting the edges of her hair with warmth. For some reason, I didn't rush to leave. "Thank you," I said quietly, my voice sounding softer in that empty room. She nodded, her expression unreadable for a moment, then she smiled, the kind of smile that feels like the start of something you can't quite name yet. The classroom felt different the next afternoon. The sun had already started its slow descent, casting long streaks of amber light across the tiled floor. Only a handful of voices echoed faintly in the hallway before fading away, leaving the room in a hush that almost invited secrets to stay. I found myself at her desk, a small stack of papers between us. She motioned for me to sit, her hand lightly brushing the surface of the desk as if to clear a space, a gesture both casual and oddly deliberate. Her movements had a quiet confidence, the kind that came from years of teaching, yet there was something softer in the way she looked at me today. Perhaps it was just the light. Or perhaps it was something else. She picked up my assignment, flipping through the pages with the kind of care you'd give to something you actually wanted to understand. Her fingertips traced the edge of a paragraph, her nails catching the paper softly. "This," she said, pointing to a section I had written late at night, unsure of its worth, "is where you stopped following the rules and started thinking." I leaned closer, curious. Our sleeves brushed, just barely, but enough for me to notice how warm her skin felt beneath the thin fabric. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned another page, her voice low and steady, each word deliberate. "Most students memorize. You observed. That's what real learning looks like." I didn't know how to answer that, not right away. The compliment hung there, somewhere between professional and personal, and I could feel my heart picking up the smallest bit of speed. I shifted slightly, resting my arm on the desk. Her perfume, soft, not sweet, more like rain on warm stone, drifted across the narrow space between us. "You make it sound like I knew what I was doing," I finally said, a half-smile tugging at my lips. She looked at me then, really looked, and for a moment, the classroom didn't feel like a classroom at all. It felt like a pause in the rhythm of everything else, a quiet place where two people were simply allowed to notice each other. "Sometimes," she said, her eyes steady on mine, "we stumble into the right path without realizing it." The clock above the whiteboard ticked faintly, the only sound in the room. Outside, a breeze nudged at the windows, rattling them softly. She closed the folder, her fingers lingering a heartbeat too long on the paper before sliding it toward me. "Keep going," she said, her voice returning to its usual calm, but her expression carried a trace of something less formal, something more human. "You've got more in you than you think." As I gathered my things, I felt the faintest brush of her sleeve against mine again, a small and silent reminder of the space we were starting to share, not with words, but with presence. By the time I left the classroom that day, the halls were nearly empty. The usual chatter and clatter of students had faded into a distant murmur, replaced by the soft patter of rain against the windows. It was the kind of evening that made the world feel smaller, more intimate, as if the building itself was breathing slower. She stepped out a few paces behind me, closing the door with a soft click. Her heels echoed faintly against the linoleum as she caught up. I slowed my pace without thinking, the kind of instinct you follow before you even realize why. "Looks like the rain settled in for the night," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that contrasted the cool air drifting through the hallway. She had an umbrella in hand, navy blue with a slim wooden handle, the kind that seemed to belong to someone who appreciated small details. I nodded, glancing at the windows where droplets raced one another down the glass. "Guess we're both leaving late." She gave a quiet chuckle, the sound light but not forced. "Comes with the job. Papers don't grade themselves." We reached the stairwell together, the lights above flickering slightly as if even they were ready to go home. I noticed then how the rain softened the edges of everything outside, the parking lot lights glowed like halos, the trees swayed with a muted rhythm. She paused at the landing, looking out toward the rain, her expression momentarily distant. "This kind of weather," she murmured, "always reminds me of when I first started teaching. I used to stay late almost every night, telling myself it was for the students. Maybe it was also because I didn't want to go home to an empty apartment." The words weren't heavy, but they held something real, a small piece of herself she didn't often hand out. I turned slightly, watching her profile as she spoke. The way the dim light touched her hair, the faint crease near her brow, the soft sigh she released, it felt like a side of her few people got to see. "You don't seem like someone who lets rain slow them down," I said, not to break the silence, but to keep her from drifting too far away in it. She glanced at me, a hint of a smile pulling at the corner of her lips. "Sometimes, it's nice to have someone to walk through it with." That sentence lingered, heavier than the air around us. She opened her umbrella and tilted it slightly in my direction, an unspoken gesture that made the space between us feel just a little less formal. As we stepped outside, the rain tapped gently against the fabric above, a soft percussion that made the rest of the world blur. I could feel the faint chill of the evening brushing my skin, but beside her, under that shared cover, there was a quiet warmth, not from the weather, but from the way her presence settled so easily next to mine. The school had long since emptied, the corridors stripped of their daytime noise. The hum of the vending machine outside the staff office was the only sound that broke the quiet. I found myself standing just outside her office door, the handle cold beneath my fingers, as if the building itself was trying to remind me it was time to leave. She was at her desk, coat draped over the back of her chair, a single lamp casting a warm pool of light across the scattered papers in front of her. Her hair had loosened since earlier, a few strands framing her face in a way that softened her usual composure. She looked up as I entered, a faint surprise flickering across her features before it settled into a small, knowing smile. "You stayed late again," she said gently, not as a reprimand but more as an observation. "Most people would be halfway home by now." I shrugged, feeling strangely rooted in the doorway. I figured you might still be here. Thought I'd return that book you lent me. She nodded toward the desk. You can leave it there. Her hand hovered over a stack of papers, then fell back to her lap. You know, it's easy to lose track of time here. Sometimes, I wonder if this place asks too much of people, students, teachers, all of us. There was a pause, the kind that didn't demand filling but seemed to invite it anyway. I stepped a little closer, catching the faint scent of coffee lingering in the room, now cool and forgotten in the corner. Outside, the sky was a deep shade of blue, the kind that comes just before full night settles in. You should probably head home, she said finally, her voice quiet but not dismissive. Her eyes stayed on mine a fraction longer than the words suggested, as though they carried a different meaning entirely. Something softer. Something almost reluctant. I caught the faintest twitch in her hand, a motion like she meant to reach out, to touch my sleeve or my arm in passing, but she didn't. Instead, she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her expression carefully composed once more. I didn't mean to keep you, I said, my voice barely above the hum of the vending machine outside. She gave a small, rueful smile. You didn't. It's just, these moments, they stretch if you let them. For a heartbeat, the room felt suspended. The quiet buzz of the fluorescent lights, the faint shadow swaying across the floor from the curtain, the warmth of her presence just a step away, all of it pressed in, asking me to stay just a little longer, even as her words told me to leave. I nodded slowly, turning toward the door. Good night, I said. She hesitated before replying, her voice almost a whisper now. Good night. And, thank you for staying. The weekend air carried that soft hum of a city taking a breath, quiet streets, faint sunlight sliding through thin clouds, and the smell of fresh pastries drifting from the small coffee shop at the corner. I hadn't planned to see her there. In fact, I hadn't planned much at all, just a quick stop for caffeine before heading home. She was standing at the counter when I walked in, her hair down in a way I had never seen during school hours, a simple cardigan resting over her shoulders. The sight caught me off guard, not because she looked different, but because she looked unguarded. Her eyes found mine almost instantly, a flash of recognition followed by the kind of smile that starts slow and ends up warming an entire face. You again, she said, her tone carrying both surprise and something softer, as though this meeting belonged to a quiet rhythm neither of us had planned but both accepted. I joined the line beside her, suddenly aware of how casual my own weekend self appeared, jacket unzipped, hair still damp from the morning shower. Didn't expect to run into you outside the usual walls, I said. Neither did I, she replied, her fingers curled loosely around a paper cup as she waited for her order. I suppose it's good to be reminded we're real people somewhere beyond those desks. The barista called her name, and as she stepped forward, I noticed the way her hand brushed past the small plate of pastries, a crumb catching on her fingertip. Without thinking, she brushed it against her cardigan, then glanced at me with an embarrassed laugh. Guess some habits don't leave the classroom, she murmured. I chuckled, shaking my head. It suits you, being human. For a moment, we stood by the window, the soft clatter of cups behind us and the warmth of the shop wrapping the space between our shoulders. Conversation slipped into easier currents, weekend plans, a book she had been meaning to start, a story I told about my neighbor's cat knocking over a potted plant. It was nothing remarkable, and yet, in its ordinariness, it felt like a door gently opening. When my drink was ready, she stepped closer to make room for someone passing behind us, her sleeve brushing against my arm. The contact was light, fleeting, but enough to send a quiet ripple through that calm little shop. I should let you enjoy your morning, she said, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder. You too, I replied, though I didn't move just yet. As she turned to leave, her hand rose, hesitated for the briefest moment, then brushed an invisible speck from my sleeve, a gesture so small it could have meant nothing at all, and yet, it stayed with me long after she was gone. The classroom had taken on a different tone by the time I arrived that evening, not the bustling, hurried place of the day, but something quieter, softer. The blinds were half drawn, letting in only the fading blue of dusk. A faint hum of cicadas floated in from the courtyard, blending with the buzz of the old fluorescent lights above. She was already there, gathering her papers into a neat stack, her glasses resting low on her nose as though she'd forgotten they were even there. For a moment, I just stood in the doorway, watching her. There was a stillness about her, not tired exactly, but something reflective, as if the day had pressed its weight upon her and she hadn't yet shaken it off. "You stayed late again," she said without looking up, the faintest hint of amusement in her voice. "I guess I've been making a habit of it," I replied, stepping in. "Truth is, I didn't come for the assignment this time." That made her look up. Slowly, carefully, as though the motion itself carried weight. Her eyes searched mine, not in a way that demanded an answer, but in a way that made one feel inevitable. "What, then?" she asked, her voice low. I shrugged, but it wasn't careless. "I just didn't want to leave yet." The words hung there, suspended between us like the thin thread of light spilling across the floor. She closed the folder in front of her, her fingers resting on its surface for a moment longer than needed. "You shouldn't say things like that," she whispered. Not sternly, more like a warning meant to protect us both. "Why not?" I asked, softer than before. Her lips parted, but the answer didn't come right away. Instead, she leaned back slightly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Because lines blur," she said finally. "And once they do, it's hard to draw them again." For a moment, the room felt too still. The clock ticked above us, each second stretching longer than the last. I stepped closer, not enough to close the space, but enough to feel the warmth radiating from where she stood. She reached for the notebook we both used for notes, our hands colliding briefly. Skin against skin, nothing more than a touch, yet it felt like the world paused. Neither of us moved to pull away immediately. "There are moments," she said quietly, her fingers brushing against mine, "that feel like they shouldn't matter, and yet they do." I looked down at our hands, so close now it was hard to tell where one stopped and the other began. "Maybe," I said, "those are the moments that matter most." She didn't answer, but her hand stayed there just a heartbeat longer before she finally drew it back. The final bell of the term had rung hours ago, leaving the building hollow and still. The sun had dipped just far enough to paint the sky in fading gold, and a soft breeze drifted through the half-open classroom window. Papers that once held deadlines and instructions were now stacked neatly in a corner, their purpose complete. She stood by the window, her hand resting lightly on the sill as the curtains stirred against her arm. There was no trace of the usual rush in her movements tonight. No stack of unmarked work, no list of tasks left hanging over her. Just a stillness, the kind that comes at the end of something and the beginning of something else. I stepped inside quietly, closing the door behind me with a soft click. "You didn't have to wait," I said, though the moment the words left my mouth, I was glad she had. She turned to face me, her expression calm, though her eyes carried that same, unreadable depth I'd come to recognize. "Sometimes, the right things aren't planned," she said, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. We stood a few feet apart, the space between us filled with everything unspoken over the past weeks, the glances, the pauses, the rain, the shared coffee shop morning. All the things that had been building, quiet as a tide. "I've been thinking," she said, her fingers tracing the wooden frame of the window. "Lessons aren't always about what's written on a board or printed in a book. The most important ones are the ones that stay with you long after the class ends." I nodded slowly. "And what lesson is this?" Her gaze softened, though her voice stayed steady. "That sometimes, caring for someone, really caring, means letting the moment breathe before you name it. It means not rushing what doesn't need to be rushed." She took a step closer then, not enough to cross a line, but enough to feel the warmth of her presence again. Her hand lifted, hesitated in the air, then came to rest gently over mine as it rested on the back of a chair. The touch was quiet, no urgency, no claim, just a simple truth spoken through skin, I'm here. For a moment, neither of us moved. The breeze carried in the faint scent of rain-soaked grass, and somewhere outside, the faint hum of evening cicadas began to rise. I don't want to look back and wonder if I should have been braver, I said quietly. She smiled, not the practiced, professional smile I'd seen 100 times, but the one that belonged only to this moment. Then let's not wonder, she whispered. Let's just give it time. Let it become what it wants to be. When we finally parted, it wasn't with promises of forever. Just a quiet agreement, a look, a touch, and the knowledge that whatever came next, it would grow slowly, honestly, in its own season.